Hi, welcome to the TEAS Science Podcast with me, Tyler DeWitt. This podcast is especially for people who are preparing to take the TEAS exam. In this podcast, you can learn the science for the TEAS just by listening. And in this episode, we'll be talking about cells and the parts inside, which are called organelles. We'll learn what the organelles look like and what they do. First off, here's how the podcast works. People planning to take the TEAS are some of the busiest people I know. They're often juggling families, jobs. They don't have a lot of free time to sit down and study. I've realized that you can learn about 95% of the TEAS science information by just listening. So I wanted to make these podcasts to help you study for the TEAS when you can't sit down and read. When you're cooking dinner, working out, driving to pick up the kids, even sitting at your job, whatever. If you can listen, you can learn, and you can get ready for the test. Here's what I'll do. I'm going to explain these topics slowly and patiently, and I'm going to do it in a way that makes sense and hopefully is actually interesting. I'm going to go for a speed where you can actually absorb the information and learn it. Here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to read a bunch of definitions at you. If you just want to hear people read complicated definitions one after the other, there are plenty of YouTube TEAS videos where people do that. And trust me, it's not going to help you learn. This TEAS science stuff is hard. And if you want to actually learn it, you need someone to go slowly, break it down, and explain it in simple terms that actually make sense. As I go over stuff, I'll often repeat concepts and words, sometimes in different ways, to make sure that you remember them. It might sound a little repetitive at times, and that's exactly the point. We learn through repetition over and over. How many times have you remembered something perfectly after hearing it just once? Rarely? Never? I don't want to waste your time here. The way I'm explaining this information, I think it's going to be crystal clear by the end of the lesson. The concepts will be solid in your memory, and you'll be one step closer to crushing the TEAS. So what do you need to do? Well, basically just listen and pay attention. I'll explain pretty much everything using words, but for a few concepts, it might help to look at a diagram. You don't have to, but it might help. If you're watching the video version of this podcast, just glance at the screen. Otherwise, you can download a study sheet for each episode at my website, teasinOneday.com/podcast. The diagrams are in those study sheets, and you can just glance at them from time to time during the podcast. Then, when you're done with the episode, you can practice the concepts with a worksheet and make sure you're totally solid on everything before you move on. Once again, you can find the study sheets as well as more podcast episodes at my website, teasinOneday.com/podcast. Okay, enough background. Let's start out learning about cells and their parts. Cells are the building blocks of all living things. If you took most parts of a living thing and zoomed in closer and closer, you would eventually start to see the cells that make it up. In many cases, the cells look almost like little square bricks or little round bags, and thousands of them are packed right up next to each other, just like bricks in a brick wall. To give you an idea of how small cells are, our bodies are made of somewhere around 30 trillion cells. In a human, there are many different kinds of cells, and they all look a little bit different. Skin cells look like little bricks. Muscle cells sometimes look like long hot dogs. And nerve cells look like little stars connected to a long wire. Certain types of cells might look different from each other on the outside, but they all have pretty much the same stuff inside, and they all work in pretty much the same way. This is a lot like how people can look very different from each other on the outside, but they all have the same organs, and their bodies all work in the same way. So let's start zooming in more on cells. Let's imagine a single cell. Maybe it's a skin cell. it would be pretty small. About 200 of those cells could fit on the period at the end of a sentence. But we're going to imagine that we can zoom in closer and closer until this tiny cell looks like a big round ball. Now, imagine that the skin on this ball is clear and you can look inside. Inside the cell, it looks like there's clear goo or jelly, and there's all sorts of objects floating around in there. There's a pretty big ball in the center of the cell. It looks kind of like a big golf ball. And that big ball in the middle is surrounded by stuff that looks like wavy, folded sheets. Floating in the jelly, there are a lot of objects that have the shape of jelly beans, and lots of others that look like round balls. And if you look really closely, you can see tiny little dots, little specks all over the place. Some of the dots are floating in the clear jelly, and some of them are attached to the wavy sheets that are near the ball in the center of the cell. These objects that you'd see inside the cell, they're called the organelles. Just like the organs inside a person, the organelles in a cell all have different shapes and different jobs, and they work together to keep the cell alive. In fact, the word organelle means little organ. If you have the cell graphic handy, you can glance at it, but the picture you have in your head is probably just fine for now. And just so you know, when we see diagrams of the cell is usually drawn as if it's cut in half, or like there is a wedge that was cut out of it. This is because if you're looking into a cell from the outside, it can be hard to see all of the stuff on the inside of a cell. So imagine that you have an orange or a grapefruit or something, and you cut it in half or cut out a slice so that you can get a better look at the insides. That view is how the cell is usually shown. Remember that cells don't really look like that. The view you see is like the cell got sliced and you're just looking in at part of it. So now we'll start walking through the different organelles and the jobs that they do. We'll break them into groups so that they're easier to learn. First, we'll start out with the organelles that make up the major structure of the cell. These are the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, the nucleus, and the cytoskeleton. The plasma membrane. The cell is surrounded by a skin or a barrier. This is called the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. I like to think of the cell membrane almost like a thin, clear plastic bag that holds everything inside the cell. The job of the plasma membrane is to keep the cell separate from the outside. In other words, the plasma membrane keeps the insides in and the outside out. The cell membrane is very important because the environment inside the cell needs to be different from the environment outside. It's like your house. For example, the temperature inside your house is probably different from the temperature outside. The walls of your house form a barrier that lets you maintain a different environment inside the house than the environment outside the house. For the cell, it wants to hold in food and keep out poisons and make sure it's not too acidic or too basic inside. What the cell wants inside is going to be very different from how the environment is outside. The plasma membrane allows the cell to maintain its internal environment. That's a fancy way of saying that the plasma membrane helps the cell keep its insides just the way it wants them. So the plasma membrane allows the cell to maintain its internal environment. But the membrane isn't a solid barrier that stops everything. The walls of your house have doors and windows, and certain things can go in and go out through those openings. The plasma membrane is the same way. It lets some things in and it lets other things out. Some things can pass through the membrane. For example, water can pass through the membrane. The cell can pull food in through the membrane, and the cell can send waste out through the membrane. But there are many things that the cell wants to keep inside or wants to keep outside, and those things usually cannot pass through the membrane. Some things can pass through and others cannot. There's a term for this. It's called selective permeability. If you're selective, that means you're choosy or you're picky. And if something is permeable, that means that things can pass through it. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable, meaning that it's picky or choosy about what can pass through. Some things can pass through, but most can't. Selective permeability. So, the plasma membrane is a thin, flexible barrier that surrounds a cell. For the most part, it keeps the insides in and the outside out, allowing the cell to maintain its internal environment. But the plasma membrane doesn't block everything. It's selectively permeable. Some things can pass through, but most cannot. The cytoplasm. Now, let's move through that plasma membrane and into the cell. The inside of the cell is full of a clear, gooey, jelly-like substance. This is called the cytoplasm, and many of the organelles are just floating around in this gooey, jelly cytoplasm. The cytoplasm also describes the area of the cell that doesn't have any organelles. So if something is happening in a cell, but it isn't happening inside a specific organelle, it's happening in the cytoplasm. And sometimes things have to move from one organelle to another. In that case, they have to move or transfer through the cytoplasm. Once again, the cytoplasm is the jelly-like substance inside the cell that the organelles are floating around in. Things that don't happen inside an organelle happen in the cytoplasm. The cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is just what it sounds like. It's a skeleton that holds the shape of the cell. You know how when you go into a big store like Home Depot or Walmart and you look up at the ceiling, you see those big metal beams holding up the roof? That's like the cytoskeleton in a cell. For whatever reason, you don't usually see the cytoskeleton in diagrams of the cell, but it would look like long threads that are right on the inside of the plasma membrane, just like the metal beams on the inside of the roof at Walmart. There is one small part of the cytoskeleton that usually is in diagrams, and that is the centrioles. The centrioles usually look like two little ziti noodles, or two little toilet paper rolls made of spaghetti sticks. The centrioles are kind of like construction workers that can make new threads of cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is long threads inside the plasma membrane that hold the shape of the cell. And the centrioles, which look like two little ziti noodles, can make new threads of cytoskeleton. The nucleus. If you're looking inside the cell, you'd see a pretty big ball kind of in the middle. In many cells, it might be like 20% of the whole cell is taken up by this big ball. And in diagrams, it often looks like a golf ball with a texture on the surface and lots of little holes. This is the nucleus. The nucleus contains the cell's DNA. The nucleus is like a vault or a safe for keeping the DNA secure. DNA has a very important job. It contains the information that tells a cell what to do, how to act, what things to make, and so forth. The DNA is like the instructions for how to run the cell. You can think of it as the hard drive for the cell. Since the DNA is stored in the nucleus is kind of like the central command center of the cell, since it has the hard drive or the information for how to run everything. To be a bit more technical, we can say that the nucleus regulates the activities of the cell. In other words, it tells a cell what to do. Now, the DNA is in the nucleus, but sometimes the TEAS will use other words to refer to the DNA. For one, DNA is sometimes called hereditary material. So that's a term you should be familiar with. Hereditary material can mean DNA. You might also hear it called the genetic material. And the nucleus contains a ton of DNA that's broken up into smaller, more convenient pieces of DNA called chromosomes. So you might also see the T's asking about where the chromosomes are found. Well, chromosomes are pieces of DNA, so they're found in the nucleus. In review, the nucleus is a big ball in the middle of the cell and contains the DNA, which might also be referred to as hereditary material, genetic material, or chromosomes. Since the DNA contains information for how to run the cell, the nucleus is like the central command center. It regulates the activities of the cell. Now, let's review everything we've just talked about by doing some TEAS practice problems. What organelle directs the activity of the cell? The nucleus, the cytoplasm, the plasma membrane, or the mitochondria? Well, right off the bat, you should know that it's the nucleus. It contains the DNA. One of the choices was mitochondria, and that might have been tricky for you because we haven't talked about that yet. But the T's will often try to trick you and give you terms you don't know. Just focus on what you do know. In this case, you know what the nucleus does. So even if you see a scary term on the test and you don't understand it, don't get tripped up. Focus on what you do know. Next question. Waste is not leaving the cell properly. What organelle is most likely the source of the problem? Nucleus, cytoplasm, plasma membrane, or cytoskeleton? The answer is the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane is a selectively permeable barrier around the cell that lets some things in and lets other things out. So, if waste is not leaving the cell the way it should, it's probably because it can't pass through the membrane and there's some kind of problem there. One more. A cell doesn't have the proper shape. What organelle is most likely the source of the problem? Nucleus, cytoplasm, plasma membrane, or cytoskeleton? Cytoskeleton. It's like the skeleton for the cell, and it holds its shape. Now, what would these organelles look like? You might not have a diagram in front of you, but you can still practice this, no problem. There's an arrow pointing to the skin around the cell. What's it pointing at? The plasma membrane or the cell membrane. An arrow is pointing at a big ball in the middle of the cell. What's it pointing at? The nucleus that contains the DNA and regulates the activities of the cell. An arrow is pointing into the middle of the cell, and it looks like it's pointing at nothing, just empty space. What's it pointing at? The cytoplasm, which is the jelly-like goo that all the organelles float around in. See? It's pretty cool how much you can learn by just listening. Let's move on. Back to the cell. The inside of the cell is a busy place. There's tons of stuff going on. It's almost like a factory or a town. Cells are always making all sorts of things, and they're often growing. They're pulling stuff through the membrane and pushing other stuff out. They're doing all these things that they need to survive. And this requires energy. It also often produces waste. Now, we'll look at a group of organelles that are involved with energy, garbage, and storage. These are the mitochondria, the lysosome, and the vacuole. The mitochondria. The mitochondria are organelles that generate energy for the cell. From the outside, mitochondria look sort of like jelly beans or kidney beans. And if you slice them open, they're mostly hollow inside, and their wall is wavy. So they kind of look a little like pepper when you slice it open. The way the wall of a pepper isn't straight, but goes in and goes out a little bit. Since cell diagrams often show the cell sliced in half, many of the mitochondria in the diagrams are sliced too. So they'll look like jelly beans sliced in half with wavy, curved walls inside. The mitochondria are often referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. Powerhouse is an old-fashioned word that means power plant. The mitochondria takes in food and it breaks it down to get energy that the cell can use. The energy that the mitochondria generates is then stored in a substance called ATP. You can think of ATP like little batteries. The mitochondria gets energy from food, charges up ATP, and then the ATPs float out through the cytoplasm to all the different areas of the cell that need to use them for energy. And just a note on wording so you don't get confused. A single mitochondria is called a mitochondrion. So, one mitochondrion, two or more mitochondria. The mitochondria break down food to generate energy for the cell, and the energy is stored in something called ATP. Mitochondria look like little jelly beans with wavy walls inside. Now, with all of this busy stuff going on in the cell, a lot of waste gets made. The cell has old junk that it needs to throw away. That's where the lysosomes come in. They're like little bags that go around the cell and collect the garbage. They pull in the garbage, break it down, and digest it so that it can be recycled. The lysosome is like the cleanup crew, garbage truck, and recycling center all in one. Lysosomes can also help destroy viruses and bacteria that invade the cell. The lysosomes can gobble them up and break them down. Lysosomes are often depicted as little balls floating around in the cytoplasm. The vacuole. The cell makes and uses lots of different stuff. Sometimes it needs places to store things. Vacuoles are like little storage tanks for a variety of things in the cell. Vacuoles might hold water or certain nutrients like sugar. Or a vacuole might also be used to hold toxic substances and keep them away from the rest of the cell. But whatever it holds, think of a vacuole like a little storage tank. Like the lysosomes, vacuoles are often shown as little balls floating around the cytoplasm in a diagram. In fact, if you had an arrow pointing to a little round ball in the cytoplasm, you wouldn't really be able to tell whether it was a lysosome or a vacuole unless you had more information. Okay, let's pause and do some TEAS practice problems to make sure that you're remembering everything. So far, we've talked about the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, the cytoskeleton, the nucleus, the mitochondria, the lysosome, and the vacuole. A patient has a disease caused because their cells cannot break down waste. What organelle is most likely to be abnormal? The nucleus, the mitochondria, the plasma membrane, or the lysosome? The problem would probably be in the lysosome, whose job it is to pick up waste products and break them down. Now, you might be thinking that the problem is in the plasma membrane, but the plasma membrane lets waste out of the cell. It doesn't actually break down the waste. Collecting waste and breaking it down is usually the job of the lysosome. A patient has a disease caused because their cells cannot generate enough energy. What organelle is most likely to be abnormal? Nucleus, mitochondria, plasma membrane, or lysosome? The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, breaking down food to generate energy and charging up ATP. So, if the mitochondria is not functioning properly, it could cause a problem with energy production and production of ATP. What organelle may store water, nutrients, toxins, or other substances? The nucleus, the mitochondria, the vacuole, or the lysosome? That would be the vacuole. Now, let's review what these organelles would look like. An arrow is pointing at something that looks like a jelly bean or a kidney bean sliced in half with curvy walls inside. What is it? This is the mitochondria. An arrow is pointing at a little ball floating around in the cytoplasm. What is it? Well, it could be a lysosome or a vacuole, and you'd probably need more information to know which is which. Finally, you have a diagram of a cell and you're asked, choose the organelle that produces ATP. The mitochondria generates energy for the cell and stores that energy in ATP. So you'd be looking for a little jelly bean-shaped organelle that is often shown sliced in half with curvy walls inside. Now, we're going to talk about the last group of organelles. We've said that the cell is always making things. These are usually chemicals that it needs to survive. Many of the things that happen in a factory happen in a cell. Stuff gets manufactured, and then processed, and then packaged, and then shipped out to different places in the cell that need it. The organelles that we'll talk about in this last group are involved with manufacturing and shipping. Before we dive into the organelles, what's getting made here? Well, mostly two types of substances, proteins and lipids. Lipids are also known as fats. We'll talk more about these later. But proteins and lipids have many important jobs throughout the cell. So remember, the cell's making proteins and lipids. The ribosomes. Ribosomes are like tiny workers that make proteins. Proteins are substances that are made of long chains of chemicals called amino acids. So to make proteins, a ribosome attaches amino acids, one after another, into a long chain. So you know that the TEAS always likes to use confusing technical terms. We can say that the ribosomes make protein, but it's more technical to say that they perform protein synthesis. Synthesis is a technical scientific word that means making. So, ribosomes make protein or they perform protein synthesis. Ribosomes are small compared to the other organelles, and they're often shown on diagrams as tiny little dots. If you look at a ribosome up really close, it looks like a hamburger with two giant buns. But in the cell, ribosomes are so small compared to most other things, they're just shown as dots. Now, ribosomes can be found in one of two places. First, they might just be found floating around in the cytoplasm. You'll see them depicted usually as tiny dots floating in the cytoplasm. Or ribosomes might be attached to an organelle called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But before we do, remember that the ribosomes are like little workers that assemble protein. They do protein synthesis, and they're usually shown as little dots. The rough endoplasmic reticulum. The rough endoplasmic reticulum looks like a bunch of sheets that are folded over many times. You'll usually find it right outside the nucleus. There are also usually some small tubes that are mixed in with the folded sheets. And these sheets and tubes are covered with little dots. Those dots are the ribosomes that are attached. The rough endoplasmic reticulum can be a little hard to picture. This might be one of those times where we want to try and glance at the diagram if you can. As you can imagine, lots and lots of proteins get made in the rough endoplasmic reticulum because it has so many ribosomes. To use some technical wording, we can say that the rough endoplasmic reticulum is a site of protein synthesis. Site just means location or place, and remember that protein synthesis means making proteins. So, the rough endoplasmic reticulum is a site of protein synthesis. And it's called rough because all of those ribosomes attached to it make it look like it has a rough texture, kind of like sandpaper. You've heard me say endoplasmic reticulum enough. It's a long term, and we usually abbreviate endoplasmic reticulum and just call it ER. Now, the rough ER doesn't just make proteins. It also processes them. Sometimes, for example, a protein needs to be chopped into smaller pieces after it's made. or it needs to have another substance added to it. That processing can happen in the rough ER. Now, there are actually two types of endoplasmic reticulum, rough and smooth. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Smooth endoplasmic reticulum does not have ribosomes on it. Because of that, it's called smooth. The smooth ER looks similar to the rough ER, but it doesn't have the little ribosome dots on it. Sometimes there's a lot less smooth ER in a cell than rough ER. So sometimes you have to look around a diagram really hard to find a little piece of the ER that doesn't have the ribosome dots. That would be the smooth ER. The smooth ER is usually further away from the nucleus than the rough ER. The smooth ER doesn't do protein synthesis because it doesn't have ribosomes. Instead, it makes other substances. The smooth ER mostly makes chemicals called lipids, and the smooth ER also breaks down certain chemicals that might be harmful to the cell. So to review, we've got two types of endoplasmic reticulum. They both look like folded sheets and tubes. First, the rough ER, which is covered in ribosomes, where lots of proteins get made and processed. And then the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which does not have ribosomes. It's where lipids or fats get made, and it also helps to process and break down toxins. The Golgi apparatus. Now, the Golgi apparatus. After all these proteins and lipids get created by the ribosomes and the rough ER and smooth ER, they have to get sent to the correct locations within the cell. Or sometimes they might even need to get sent outside the cell. The Golgi apparatus is like a processing and shipping center for proteins and lipids. The Golgi apparatus receives substances that have been synthesized or made. The Golgi apparatus may process them a little bit more, and then it packages them and ships them off to various locations of the cell where they're needed. So, it's like the packaging and shipping department. The Golgi apparatus looks like a small stack of pancakes. The nucleolus. Finally, there's one more structure to mention, and that's the nucleolus. The nucleolus is an area within the nucleus. If you're thinking of the nucleus as a ball, the nucleolus is like a ball within a ball. The nucleolus is an area in the nucleus where ribosomes get made. Ribosomes are so important, and a cell spends so much of its resources making ribosomes that there's a special area in the nucleus that is dedicated to just this. Ribosomes are made of protein and also a substance called RNA, which we'll talk about later. So, the nucleolus looks like a ball within the nucleus, and it's the area within the nucleus where ribosomes get made. So those last organelles that we talked about are involved in the manufacturing operations. The ribosomes make protein. Ribosomes might be floating around on their own, or they might be attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, where protein synthesis and processing happens. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum doesn't have ribosomes, but it makes lipids and breaks down some toxins. And then the Golgi apparatus takes the things that have been made, processes them, packages them, and sends them out to the rest of the cell. The nucleolus is the area within the nucleus where ribosomes are made. Let's do a couple questions about this last group of organelles, and then we'll finish up with a few other concepts. Which of the following describes the function of the ribosome? Breakdown of toxins, synthesis of lipids, synthesis of proteins, or energy production? It's synthesis of protein, a fancy way to say making proteins. Which of the following statements is true of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum? It contains ribosomes, it synthesizes lipids, it synthesizes proteins, it sends proteins throughout the cell. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum does not have ribosomes, And it doesn't really do anything with proteins. It's where lipids get made or synthesized. A function of the Golgi apparatus is synthesis of proteins, sending proteins to various locations, synthesis of lipids, breakdown of toxins. Remember, the Golgi apparatus is like the shipping center for the cell. It doesn't make proteins or lipids, but it processes them, packages them, and sends them throughout the cell. So, a correct answer would be sending proteins to various locations. Okay, now remember what these things look like. Imagine that you have an arrow pointing to something that looks like folded sheets covered with lots of tiny dots. The question asks, what is the function of this organelle? Well, folded sheets covered with tiny dots would be the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Those tiny dots are the ribosomes, and they make protein. So, the function of the rough endoplasmic reticulum is the synthesis and processing of proteins. You have a diagram of the cell, and you need to identify the organelle that processes, packages, and ships proteins and lipids. Well, that would be the Golgi apparatus, and it looks like a stack of pancakes. An arrow is pointing to a tiny dot that's floating around on its own in the cytoplasm. What is it? Well, that's a ribosome. Remember, its job is to make proteins. Ribosomes are also found attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And finally, you're asked to locate the smooth endoplasmic reticulum on a diagram of the cell. This is the endoplasmic reticulum that is not covered with ribosomes. It looks like folded sheets or tubes, and it doesn't have any dots on it. It's usually right next to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and sometimes it's pretty small. Before we wrap up, there's one more thing that's important to mention. Almost all the cells in the human body have all these organelles, but the amount of organelles might differ. For example, muscle cells need to produce a lot of energy, so they have more mitochondria than many other types of cells. Cells in the stomach make a lot of digestive proteins that have to get sent out of the cell. That's a job that's done by the Golgi apparatus. So, stomach cells have a lot of those. Liver cells and muscle cells make a lot of proteins, so they have a lot of ribosomes. And if you looked at the nucleolus in liver and muscle cells, it would also be pretty big because that's where all those ribosomes are getting made. So remember that. The number of organelles can vary between cells, and that depends on the type of cell and what sorts of things that cell usually does. So, in this podcast, we covered cells and all the important organelles. Now, when you have some time, you can download the study sheet and diagrams. You can find those resources at teasinOneday.com/podcast. And you can also find more episodes at teasinOneday.com/podcast. If you liked this podcast, if it was helpful for you, or if you have any feedback for me, please let me know. You can send me email to tyler@teasinOneday.com. Thanks for listening, and best of luck getting ready for the teas.